Michael Vick was convicted of illegal dogfighting, including brutally killing 8 dogs by hanging, beating, and drowning. What he did was obviously vile. So how can I find any redemption in his story? What could Michael Vick do to redeem himself after such actions? To understand Vick's fall from grace, we need to first understand where he was falling from and what led to the fall. Growing up, Vick was elusive.
I'm sure when he was a kid and played tag, he was never it.
He was nicknamed Bullet as a kid, which just showed his athleticism from an early age. He grew up in Newport News, aka Newport Nam, as in Vietnam, so there was a lot of violence. He was electric in high school. I mean, as a senior, he had a game with 6 rushing touchdowns and 3 passing touchdowns. Despite dominating in high school, he wasn't heavily recruited by the top programs. He did receive quite a few offers, but those were schools like Georgia Tech, Syracuse, and Virginia Tech, which is where he'd actually commit. He was considering Syracuse, but growing up idolizing Donovan McNabb, he didn't really want to be in the shadow of his legacy. He wanted to make a name for himself and carve out his own path. He would do that at Virginia Tech.
Michael Vick became a common name that most people would know. But I think Virginia Tech became a name in the college football world.
He would lead them to an 11-0 season and would receive the most amount of votes for a freshman since Herschel Walker. By his second year, he was NFL bound. They'd go to the Toyota Gator Bowl, where he'd win the MVP. He set the record for a 40-yard dash by a quarterback at 4.33 seconds, which was later tied by Robert Griffin III, and he became the first black quarterback to be drafted #1 overall. He was drafted by the Falcons after they traded with the Chargers for the first pick. His second year is where he'd really take off, and he'd have the most rushing yards by a quarterback in a single game at the time with 173 yards. He would receive 4 Pro Bowl selections, 2 coming in 2002 and 2004, and he was signed to a 9-year, $130 million contract in 2004 with the Falcons. He became the first quarterback to surpass 1,000 rushing yards in 2006, but while riding high, cracks began to show. Although it wasn't Vic. With his newfound wealth, he'd support his friends and family, and some people in his group were involved in the wrong things.
Michael had a group of guys that he grew up with, and they consistently stayed around him.
A friend was arrested for distributing marijuana in 2004. Later that year, friends allegedly stole a watch at an airport, which would quickly be returned to the owner. But nonetheless, it was not a good look. He moved with 6 of his friends from his hometown to Atlanta. Now Vic takes full responsibility for his actions, but it doesn't sound like he had the best of people around him at all times, and they didn't always look out for his interest. In 2007, the police would obtain a search warrant as part of a drug investigation of his cousin. They would discover illegal dogfighting activities at his property under the name Bad News Kennels, and he was charged with financing the venture as well as participating directly in fights and killing dogs. He admitted that he was a part of 6 to 8 dog killings, and those were, as I mentioned at the beginning, by hanging, beating, and drowning. So some pretty gruesome stuff. They found the dogs buried in the backyard of his property. He would plead guilty to charges of illegal dogfighting and spend 21 months in prison, followed by 2 months of home confinement. The typical sentence, though, would have been about 6 months, but the prosecution clearly wanted to make an example because he's a high-profile person. He also served more time than the other owners of Bad News Kennels and received a lengthier sentence than almost anyone ever convicted of dogfighting. The police actually had an informant to attend dogfights. The informant struck a deal to avoid charges for dogfighting himself. Now, having an informant is one thing, but this guy actually participated in a fight against Vic with his dog, which seems like a step too far. None of what I'm going to say excuses his actions. It was gross, but we should give it some context. Firstly, he saw his first fight when he was 7.
Where I grew up at, dog fighting, I didn't know that it was legal, and I didn't know if it was illegal. I knew several people, several friends, that if they had a pit bull, you knew at some point in time they was going to fight it against somebody else who had a pit bull. That's just the way it was.
He grew up around it, it was normalized, even encouraged to an extent. The police would occasionally break it up, but they mostly turned a blind eye. So that only reinforced the idea that, it's okay, you're not going to get in trouble for this. And Vic would also declare for bankruptcy shortly after his conviction, thanks to bad advice from friends, poor investments, and overspending. So he was about $18 million in debt. That was just another indication that he didn't have the best people around him. Now, not everybody gets a second chance. And not everybody uses their second chance well, if they do get it. I think Vic did. Following his release, he became an advocate for animal rights, supporting the Animal Fighting Spectator Prohibition Act, which was signed into law in 2014, and worked with the Humane Society. Then, thanks to Donovan McNabb, a month after being released, he was signed by the Eagles to a 1-year deal for $1.6 million. He'd be a third-string backup, and none of the money was guaranteed, but it was an opportunity. In 2009, he only threw 13 passes. Then in 2010, he was bumped up to second string when the Eagles traded McNabb to the Redskins. The starter, Kevin Kolb, suffered a concussion in the season opener, so Vick actually stepped in. And in the games he started, he led the Eagles to an 8-3 record and made it to the wildcard round against the Packers. He threw 21 touchdowns and rushed for 9. He'd also win Comeback Player of the Year. He spent 5 seasons with the Eagles and did not squander his second chance. But why I think he has a great redemption arc is not that he made a great career after prison, but that he recognized his mistake, worked for the Humane Society, and pushed for anti-dogfighting legislation. We can't be in his head, but based on his actions, which is all we can really go off, he seems to have learned. Now, people question it. They say it's a PR stunt. He just wanted to get back into the league. I don't know what to tell you. I think people need a second chance, and he used the second chance well. It's not like he went back and started dogfighting again. I also wanted to compare Eagles Vick to Falcons Vick. When he got to Philly, he was great, but obviously not the prime Vick. If Michael Vick had the mindset and attitude that he developed in Philly when he played for the Falcons, I think this dude would have been even more lethal.
Where he was in Philadelphia mentally.
Everybody relax, have some fun. It's an honor and privilege to play this game.
If he'd have had that in Atlanta, you'd have been talking about one of the best quarterbacks to ever play.
While at the Falcons, he seemed to be distracted. He'd go home every week, and he was the face of Atlanta, so all that attention could be distracting to a young guy. There was a lot of untapped potential because he relied heavily on his natural ability.
You know what your reputation was like when you were playing?
Yeah.
What was it?
I was lazy, last guy in the building, first guy out. I know that. I hear everything that people say. And that hurt me when I heard that, but I know it was true.
A man who pays his debt to society and doesn't actually fall back into his old ways, I think is a man who has redeemed himself. Vick ruined his career, blew a massive contract, $100 million plus, went bankrupt, got sent to prison, and became public enemy number one. I don't see what more he could do. I mean, some people, like I said, say it's PR to save his career, and I can't tell you his motives. But in society, we don't give offenders a fair shot at redemption, and I think he has redeemed himself. Maybe you disagree though. Alright, thanks for watching.